The sheer location of the toxins is located in this, I guess I have a pointer, is located in this little box here. And the sense that the spread of these toxins goes no further than this box. But furthermore, I think that there's a sense in which the complicity, the responsibility for this poisoning has also been confined to this box. And in which the public support for things like the Cold War, in which federal taxpayer money funded Rockwell Industries and their production of all these plutonium cores, goes sort of undescribed in a picture like this. And I don't think that this is a fault of the EPA necessarily. I think that this is a larger, sort of a larger public phenomenon of wanting to protect ourselves from the sense that we are responsible for this larger toxic landscape. Now, another reason for declining enthusiasm for regulation was the sorting of industrial toxins away from prosperous and middle-class Americans. The environmental justice movement, which emerged out of the civil rights movement, challenged this sort of sorting of the toxic landscape, pointing out that industrial toxins, as with other noxious industry, tended to be located next to poor, often minority communities, and demanding that not only the public clean up these particular polluted sites, but also address the underlying injustice that had produced these distributional inequalities. So Purity Oil Sales Incorporated in Malaga, California, received industrial waste from a variety of industrial manufacturers. And they offered a cheap storage site, a cheap disposal site for that waste. And you know that you can think of that as lowering the cost of the goods produced by those manufacturers. Now, Purity Oil Sales was also not particularly careful about how it managed its site, and a series of fires released a great deal of these toxins into the ground, and very likely into the groundwater. And what you can see here is the proximity of Purity Oil Sales to this mobile home community. And what's something that's worth paying attention to is, whereas in the case of, say, the Love Canal disaster, which became this major public affair and in which the homeowners were eventually bailed out by the federal government, these owners of these mobile homes continue to live really in incredible proximity to this poisoned space. For much of the 20th century, mainstream environmentalists ignored the demands of the environmental justice movement, sometimes even exacerbating the problems and the distributional inequalities through supportive policies like emissions trading that concentrated pollution in poor neighborhoods. Though environmentalists and environmental justice activists have increasingly come together over the last 2 decades, their newfound shared purpose may have to do more with the export of industrial production and its pollution abroad than with any sort of creating of a more just society here at home. So this slide is showing the contemporary remains of the Union Carbide pesticide plant, which was established by the Union Carbide Corporation, a U.S. corporation, in Bhopal, India, in the late 1970s to manufacture many of the pesticides that had become either too expensive to manufacture in the United States because of regulation, or just too risky in terms of the sorts of public concern that were being raised about these pesticides. In 1984, the Union Carbide plant leaked methyl isocyanate gas into the surrounding city at night. And the exposure resulted in perhaps the worst industrial disaster in history. 8,000 people died from this leak, and over 200,000 people were injured. The Indian government filed suit against Union Carbide for $3.3 billion in damages, citing negligence in design and operation. And in fact, there were 4 relatively basic safety measures that were either uninstalled or inoperative at the time, of the leak. And the town's public health officials and their emergency response services had never been briefed by Union Carbide on what to do with the sort of mass leak that occurred. And in fact, when the watching engineer, when the supervising engineer realized that this leak was happening and sounded the alarm, Union Carbide, a higher official at Union Carbide, actually turned off the alarm because they didn't want to alarm the surrounding town. So Union Carbide eventually settled that $3.3 billion suit for $470 million, or about $300 per victim. And though Union Carbide shut the plant down, they refused to pay for remediation of the toxic poisoning in the area. Their CEO, Warren Anderson, returned to India amidst great public consternation in both the US and India, and he was promptly arrested, and just as promptly, about 2 hours later, he posted bail and left the country and never returned. And Union Carbide continued, the Indian government continues to advocate that Union Carbide come back and clean up its mess, though it doesn't look like it's going to do so. Remedies to the toxic landscape have also sometimes divided environmentalists among themselves. So if any of you have spent any time in the Hudson River Valley, you might recognize these signs which warn you not to eat fish in the river, in part because of the concentration of PCBs released by the General Electric plant. Now these sorts of signs, even though they were informed by, beginning in the 1960s when they started to be posted, they were informed by this concern for the public's health. These provoked sort of a very strong reaction among commercial fishermen as well as recreational fishermen, because they threatened to transform the relationship those people had with the river. So whereas the environmentalists who use the river as recreationalists could continue to use the river, these signs don't prohibit canoeing or hiking, these fishermen who knew the landscape in a different fashion were being asked, or in some cases prohibited, from doing so. And so those two groups of fishermen had served as early supporters of local environmentalist campaigns on the Hudson. And it's actually this warnings against PCBs and environmentalist support for these PCBs have often served as a wedge. So in an earlier research project, when I was looking at a particular environmentalist project on the Hudson in the 1960s, I interviewed someone from one of these environmentalist organizations who'd grown disenchanted, and what he said is that he'd been a fisherman on the river for as long as he'd been alive, and he, starting in the 1960s and the 1970s, he started to be told by many of these people who he was joined with in these environmentalist campaigns that he should no longer be eating these fish, and that he could no longer guide people to fish on this river. And this hasn't stopped him. He claims to eat the fish from the Hudson nearly every day. And when I spoke to him last year, I think he was like 81 or 82 years old, and he's still alive and kicking. So take from that what you will, but you can see how these sort of prohibitions in the landscape can transform how people use it and potentially serve as a wedge. Now, beyond the considerable challenges that we face in trying to assign complicity for the production of particular toxins, some toxins in the landscape are produced by forces that simply boggle our minds in trying to figure out what to do about complicity. So as you'll see in the Dana Goodyear essay, or the article that comes out of the New Yorker, there's a toxic fungus that naturally inheres in the soil of the American Southwest. Development in that region, which we've discussed in this course, stirs up that toxic fungus, and it poses a respiratory risk for the people that live there. One thing to think about for our section this week is how to even go about figuring out where complicity for the sorts of human health consequences of the stirring up of that toxin should lie. So how we take something that is in fact natural and completely outside the production of humans, but that human activity widely diffused across the landscape has turned into a health risk, and figure out some way of who should be responsible for that sort of poison. Now, in the last section of this lecture, I'd like to think about how we've chosen to represent the toxic landscape. Taking Jackson's definition of a landscape as a cohesive scene, comprehensible at a glance, I want to shift our focus a bit and conclude with several different representational strategies. So most toxins, the problem with representing the toxic landscape is that most toxins are invisible. And even deeply contaminated landscapes often look relatively unremarkable. Yet those concerned about toxicity and desiring to do something about it know that they have to evocatively illustrate this problem, to evocatively show the extent of this poisoning in order to get a response, to get some protection. And so a variety of strategies result. One representational strategy might be what we could call the toxic normal, in which ordinary sort of vernacular landscapes are shown so as to increase the viewer's sense of apprehension that something must be lurking beneath the surface. So this picture comes from this David Hansen photographic or book of photographic essays on the toxic landscape. And many of these pictures from this lecture come from that book. What Hansen is doing here with this picture is he's showing this, on say an opposite page of a much more clearly toxic landscape to show that this toxicity isn't just confined to what we might normally recognize as polluted landscapes. Now, another strategy is what Jennifer Peoples calls the toxic sublime. Taking off, and though you might not recognize the term, you're probably familiar with the form. So taking off from the idea of the industrial sublime, which we discussed earlier this semester, Peoples defines the toxic sublime as the tensions that arise from recognizing the toxicity of a place while simultaneously appreciating its mystery, magnificence, and ability to inspire awe. So what Peoples is arguing is that the dissonance between the sort of awesomeness and even the potential beauty of these landscapes and the pain that the toxicity causes will provoke in the viewer an emotional reaction that will move them past rationality and possibly produce radical change. Others critique this sort of representational strategy, and I'll discuss sort of a number of ways that you form the toxic sublime. So you can perhaps think of this as three critical factors. One is the use of color, and especially in contrast or in striking hues, like you can see here. This is another Hansen photograph, as a way of visually denoting the presence of toxins. So though we might not know exactly what's causing the brilliant yellow and the red in this picture, I think we have a sense that there's something that's unnatural and not right about this water. Another critical feature is perspective. And Peoples argues that users of the toxic sublime often situate the viewer in a position, a vantage from above. So both invoking the sense that they're responsible for this landscape, as well as an uncertainty about their place in it. And she's hoping that this uncertainty is in fact productive. Scale is another critical feature for these images. On the one hand, a large scale both shows the magnitude of the problem and evokes this sublime. But the problem with a large scale is, one, it has the potential to obscure the more mundane toxins, such as I discussed in that Miami-Dade County landfill, the toxins that we can readily see ourselves contributing to, as well as evoking a sense of helplessness in us as we view this image. So the toxicity here might be seen as so overwhelming that we can do nothing about it. Humans are often left out of these pictures, and this is sort of an open question about whether or not this erases the victims of the pain caused by these particular landscapes, or makes victims of us all. Now, a few more strategies here. So this picture is from the internet. This isn't from Langston's article, but it shows an intersect smallmouth bass in the Potomac River in Virginia. So a fish that, being exposed to these estrogenic chemicals that you'll read about, or that you've read about, has now developed both female and male genitalia, which, as you can probably imagine, makes it very hard for this species to reproduce. And so I'm calling this the toxic alarm. And in thinking back to the Cronin reading, I think Langston and others are in line with that sort of establishment of a second nature in which we live, in which the first nature, the nature of smallmouth bats, has been completely transformed by humans, even at sort of the subtle level of transforming gender, or I guess I should say not the subtle level, but the level that requires a little bit more sleuthing to discern. And yet we live in this landscape, and these organisms can serve as bellwethers for our health and the presence of toxin in our body. And so users of this sort of prevailing, or this reading of animals as relevant to our own toxic poisonings trade on this sense of our holistic connection to the environment. So this comes from the Atlas of Radical Cartography, and what the producers of this map or this visualization is set out to do is, as you can probably tell, to connect the U.S.'s oil dependence in 2006 to the different social circumstances in which that energy is produced. So maybe you can see these metrics here of different features of sort of the social environment. So you have everything from the poverty rate here to the percentage of children born underweight, life expectancy, gross per capita income. And what they've done is they've shown these various countries where oil comes in the United States and tried to get a sense of what the social circumstances there are like, and possibly connect that to the sorts of circumstances, the physical circumstances in which that oil is being produced. Another one of my favorites, this is from Rebecca Solnitz, An Infinite City in Atlas of San Francisco, which those of you who like maps like me might recognize. And so this is the Bay Area, obviously. And what Solomon has tried to do is to connect the locavore present with this toxic past. So whereas most of the people who travel up to Sonoma might not recognize their proximity to these various mercury mines that were used to facilitate gold and silver mining in the 19th century, Solnit's trying to show these two layers of history on top of each other so that you get a sense of what this actual landscape is like. And you can see here.
So the dark ones are...
Yeah, sorry, it's despite my extensive scanning efforts, it appears not to come out quite as clear. Yeah, so sorry. So the dark ones here are sites of industrial pollution. In green are sites of sort of like the locavore San Francisco present and all its wonderful cheese production, etc. And then the small dots that are purple here are vineyards. You can see the vineyards here and the vineyards here in Napa and Sonoma. And so you can imagine that if you are attending your artisanal pickle manufacturing conference, you might pick up this book and recognize that in fact you're inhabiting a landscape in which another form of production had happened, and one that had left this profound consequence on the landscape. Now, perhaps my favorite slide from this lecture, this one comes from my own walking life around the city, and I read it as a quite cynical concern from the management of this condo tower on 110th and Lenox for the concern of my dog. So I walk by this several times a day, and it's always sort of perked me, so it's delightful finding it to expose it to the world, or at least to you, 40 people. Another challenge that is sort of fascinating and is an ongoing project is how hazardous waste, how the dangers of hazardous waste will be communicated to future generations. So one of the problems with nuclear energy is that the toxins it produce have extraordinarily long half-lives. Plutonium, for instance, has a half-life of 24,000 years. So they remain incredibly hazardous for time periods that extend far beyond any sorts of planning capacity, or that we might even, in our most wildly optimistic thinking, might imagine for our society. So one of the challenges are, and at this point, I think people are sort of more morbidly fascinated with this, is how you communicate to future generations not to touch that stuff. And if you think about the pyramids, which contain their own set of warnings to not touch the stuff for fear of great bodily harm, those warnings only sort of excited the enthusiasm of the people that discovered those sites. And so This is the biohazard